Good day. This is your lecture on Islam, and it will be the challenge to the Christian Western region and also obviously the Byzantine region. We didn't have a lot on Byzantium, but that's okay. We'll get a little understanding of Islam, its origins, and its rise to a golden age in which there was some philosophical and scholarly production at the time. We'll have a look at those things. Right? Its rise began around 600. Muhammad himself is believed to have lived from 570 to 632. The 570 date is less certain. The 632 date seems to be pretty agreed upon as the year that Muhammad died. The sources for Muhammad and his life are the Quran, and the Quran is believed by Muslims to be a collection of the revelations to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel that were probably, I think the understanding is written down by people who heard Muhammad speak and, were witness to Muhammad's inspiration. The Hadith is written after Muhammad's death by people who knew him, or that's the belief by by Muslims themselves. So Hadith was a collection. It's kind of like the Christian Gospels, right? The Gospels are believed to have been written by people who knew Jesus. Our historians think that some of them are dated somewhat later than that because of some of the things that are said in the Gospels, but same thing with the Hadith, right? Whether they actually knew him or not is somewhat up to debate, but nonetheless that's what it is, a collection of those people who knew and their tales of Muhammad. Muhammad comes from a family, the Quraysh, and he was orphaned from his mother and father died very early, and he was raised by his uncle. He would marry later a woman who had been married to a merchant and did quite well apparently, so he took up the merchant business with her. We usually note this because in the Quran there's many prescriptions for merchants who are buying and selling things, and we don't quite get the same thing in the Bible and in the Christian world. In fact, those people who make profit in the Christian world are seen as somehow doing something suspect by Christianity. And in the Quran it seems to be embedded and accepted, and so there are prescriptions for buying and selling. And we usually note that because of the nature of his marriage to a merchant. So that's probably the importance of his wife Khadija and their marriage, in addition to the fact that they were said to have had four children, 3 sons and a daughter, and the three sons died, and then only the daughter was left, and her name was Fatima. There was a period in which Muhammad decided to go to the mountains outside of Mecca for a spiritual revival. And in this period when he was fasting in the mountains, he had revelations by the angel Gabriel. And these are the word of God that he brought to his followers, right? And that were written down in the Quran. He quickly generated a large hatred against him by the people in Mecca who were polytheists, because he was very critical of their worship of especially statues and so idols, and so he's a big critic of that, and they chased him out of Mecca because he didn't have very many followers at the time, and he went to a city north of Mecca by about, I think, 200 miles, and it's called Medina, and he spent 12 years there, and this 12-year period is called the Hijra, and he gained a big community of followers in those 12 years, and they returned to Mecca, and they conquered Mecca. So Muhammad starts out by the need to protect himself against his critics and his detractors, and then he also starts out with a reconquest of Mecca itself. After he dies, the community is quickly split between those who think that the rightful imam, The religious leader must come from Muhammad's family line, and those people were known as Shia. And the second big sect in Islamic world is that the Sunni. And the Sunni believe that imams should be chosen by a community, by the community itself. Right? The spread of Islam. After Muhammad dies, there are 4 right-thinking caliphs that were either knew him or were his associates, or in fact Ali, who was his nephew. And they would finally be displaced by the Umayyad clan. And the Umayyad Empire would be built and extended from the Indus River all the way to Spain between 661 and 750. So it would give or take about 90 years. The caliph was the head of the community, who was both a religious and a political head, and seen as the successor to Muhammad himself. Right? The Umayyad were a Sunni clan, and so the successor was expected to be chosen by the Islamic community. Again, they spread by 650 all the way into Spain. That's pretty extraordinary. Muhammad and the 4 right-thinking caliphs will conquer most of what is the Middle East today, Saudi Arabian, and down into all the way to Egypt. And then the Umayyads spread across North Africa to Spain, and they spread beyond the Mesopotamian region into the Indus Valley. So the Umayyad controlled quite a large empire in a very short period of time. They were replaced by the Abbasid, which was originally very strong in about 750, and they quickly were weakened by about 900, but they lingered on until 1258, when Mongol invasions took over the region. The Abbasid were a Shia clan, or a Shia. They were Shia Muslims. And they put their capital in Baghdad, so they moved it inland and were linked to, and in some ways, at least if we look at the Golden Age and the scholars, dominated by Persian culture to some extent. Like I said, they were displaced by the Mongols in 1258 when the Mongols finally conquered Baghdad. So Baghdad fell. That is seen in military history as one of the worst defeats of a city. They think that maybe 200,000 people were killed by this Mongol invasion, who were pretty fierce enemies. I mean, they like to leave people to run free, to warn those that they were coming to, the terror with which they conquered places. Just to tie the story, the political history up very quickly, right? I'm just going to mention the Ottoman Turks, who were on the rise at about 1300 or 1293 in the Middle East. The Turks came out of the Central Eurasian region and adopted Muslim culture, and then slowly they would start to build their empire, and finally, about mid of this period from 1293 to 1922, they defeat Constantinople, and then they have control of the Black Sea and all the region around it, and then all the way down into North Africa as well, and the Middle East. So the Ottoman Empire was a very large empire. So the sack of Constantinople was the most important thing it did in terms of political extension, because the Byzantines were in control of Constantinople, and that was the one thing that was keeping them from the regions in Europe. That happens in 1453, and 1453 is a big date historically, because that is the end of Byzantium and the bulwark against Muslim militaries in Europe. They will go beyond Constantinople, which they rename Istanbul, and they will try to conquer, and they almost get to Vienna. They stop outside of Vienna, and they're stopped right at that area. If you go look at a map, and the distance between Tours, which is the 732 Charles Martel victory, and Vienna, it's not very much. Those Muslim militaries almost take all of Europe. Here's a map. The areas that you want to notice the most are the green area, which is Muhammad and the 4 right-thinking caliphs, the 4 orthodox caliphs, so the very earliest Muslim rulers. The purple, or the plum-looking color that goes all the way into Spain is Umayyad, and then you can see it extends as far as the Indus, and then finally Abbasid extend their control in the orange, and you can see it's into Africa a little bit further. It's up into the Caspian Sea area and then onto the Ganges River, and then a little bit into the Anatolia right here, just below the Black Sea. And you can see Constantinople sits here, and that's the big target for them. That's the big nexus. Constantine was not wrong that was the highway, that was the central point of the highway between the Near East, or the Middle East, and Europe. All right, the religious obligations, there are 5 pillars in the Islamic faith. You should know the Shahada is the requirement to, the Shahada is the acceptance as God, of Allah as the one God and Muhammad as his rightful messenger. You're expected to pray 5 times a day. You are expected on the month of Ramadan to fast. You are expected to give charity to, and it could be to those who need it, to the state. The term is zakat. Sometimes Islamic states will charge an income tax, basically. That is the zakat. And then you're expected to take a hajj to Mecca. And Mecca is the Mecca. The hajj is a trip to Mecca, to the Kaaba. We'll look at the Kaaba in just a second. And to sort of reify your Islamic beliefs, right? You're expected to do a hajj once a year if you can afford it, once a lifetime if you can afford that, and then in spirit if you are unable to afford going to Mecca literally. I just want to mention another thing. This is not part of the 5 obligations, but since we're currently faced with some Muslim individuals who believe they are on a jihad against the infidel. It's war against the infidel, and the warrior is a mujahideen. So those are a few words that we hear quite often these days in popular presses, right? Jihad is a concept that is both a literal war and many Muslims today see it as an internal war between God and the infidel within the self. So it's viewed in both ways. I know in the popular presses we most often see it represented as a literal war between infidels, and in the West we look at the Christians and Muslim warriors, right, mujahideen. Islamic texts, as we've already encountered, the Quran, or the revelations to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. The Hadith are the writings of the Prophet's life by those who knew him. And there is a body of Islamic law that's called Sharia. And Islamic law is a compilation of laws and debates and discussions over what is the true spirit of Islam and how it should manifest itself in the law. So they do have quite a history of jurisprudence for Islamic law. In addition, there's a word for the community in Islam, and that's ummah, and there's a word for the scholarly community, which is the ulama. Outsiders to this community of believers are the dhimmi, who are the people of the book, and the people of the book are Christians and Jews. So they are co-travelers, right? Muhammad seems to have found some inspiration from Christians and Jews who were in Mecca itself. And so if you read the Quran, you'll find that there is reference to prophets from the Old Testament, for example. So Muhammad himself considered Christians and Jews as fellow travelers if less informed, because they didn't accept Muhammad as the final and the true prophet, right? But you see in the Quran that there are references to prophets from the Old Testament. So those are people of the book, Christians and Jews, and they were expected to pay a tax so they could live in their own communities. And they paid a tax, and they were subject to Islamic law. And Islamic law usually meant that the Christians and Jews were less privileged in law than Muslims. So they couldn't wear clothes that Muslims wore. They had to have smaller houses and temples than the Muslim mosque, right? So they couldn't own horses in some cases. So those were things that Islamic law subjected Christians and Jews to. The Islam's golden age is during the Abbasid Empire, so about 800 to 1200. One of the earliest caliphs, Al-Mansur, is the one who was the most inspirational in the beginning to cultivate scholarship and to build libraries. So Al-Mansur is sort of the author of this golden age. In these libraries you'll find astronomy, medicine, alchemy, and mathematics, geometry. All of those subjects are largely pursued by the Muslim scholars in this golden age. Al-Khwarizmi is one of the scholars, and he is the discoverer of algebra. In fact, the word algebra comes from the Islamic word. And later, we have a scholar, Al-Biruni, and he's a geographer, and he will estimate the Earth's circumference, and it's very close. I don't know. I think he's a little bit larger than the Earth actually is, but he gets a very close estimation of the Earth's circumference. And I know we have in our lore that Christopher Columbus thought the Earth was flat, but they didn't. Even in this period, they're suggesting, or they're estimating. They're so sure are they of the roundness of the Earth. So this is the 11th century into the 10th and early 11th century. Earth's circumference. Avicenna, same period, similar period. He will write medical manuals. He is a resident of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, so a lot of the information from even Sina, who his Latinized name is Avicenna. A lot of that information was written in both Arabic and in Latin, or at least got translated to Latin. This is Al-Idrisi, who is a geographer, his representation of the Mediterranean region. If you look closely, it's upside down and kind of what we would call backwards, but just know that it's upside down. So you have the Straits of Gibraltar here, you have Spain coming up here, you have a pretty funky Italian peninsula, but nonetheless you can see Sicily down here. And remember the period, this is done in 1154, so the 12th century. It's upside down, but it's better than what any map in Europe that they had at this point, right? So then if you went back down Spain and then across the north, what we call North African region, right, you can see, and then you're headed over here to what is Egypt, and here's the Nile. Here is the Red Sea, the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and you're coming back up to Anatolia and Turkey today and across onto what is the Balkan Peninsula, and this is Greece. You can see our Cyclades here. You can see the entry into the Black Sea here, and then the Caspian Sea. So these are what Al-Idrisi understood as the nature of the world. So it's a pretty good representation given that you're just mid-12th century here when this map is made. And Al-Idrisi worked in Sicily, so he made the map for Roger II of Sicily. The Golden Age continues. The second, or the last scholar is Ibn Rushdi, and his Latinized name is Averroes. So we have a lot. Again, he, like Avicenna, were scholars on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, right? His interest was philosophy, and he is a 12th century thinker. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle that joined other commentaries, translations of Euclid, who was a Greek during the Roman period, who was a geographer, and Galen and Hippocrates, who are two Greek medical journals. So they translated the Greek medical and geometry into Arabic. And then that we would get those in Latin, and I believe that's the way that we assumed those particular texts. This is the end of the Golden Age and the expansion of Islam. You can see that really in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, Islam and Islamic culture is producing at least scholarship that's ahead of the West. So it's a big curiosity for us why the West takes off and the Middle East does not, as we end up in the modern age. So that's one of the big curiosities for world history. I think you have to go on and take history too to really understand that, because you've got to look at the age of Enlightenment and the Renaissance. And the Renaissance would get some works from the Iberian Peninsula, and then up, in other words, up through the Islamic areas on the Iberian Peninsula, and they do preserve some texts as we've looked at, right? Euclid, Galen, Hippocrates, right? So we do get some through that area, but very few, right? Most of the texts are either in libraries and monasteries, and the Latinized, especially the Latin texts that come from the Roman period, for example. And they've been just put away, the ones that are not accepted. The Greek, much of that comes through Byzantium. When Byzantium falls, texts and scholars who can read the ancient Greek come to the West into the Renaissance. And we'll talk about that a little more later. This is in Mecca, the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is a building that has a stone in one of its corners. And before the crowd, this is the crowds that have made their Hajj to Mecca, and they walk around the Kaaba, I think 6 or 7 times. And the ideal used to be that you would touch this stone in the corner of the Kaaba, but it's not really possible now for people to touch stone. In fact, I don't think they allow it. But anyways, this stone is believed to, scientists think it was a meteorite that fell to the earth in the period in which Muhammad was alive. All right, so that's the Kaaba. That's the goal of the Hajj, is to get to the Kaaba and pray as you walk around the Kaaba. It's actually in technically what is a mosque. Inside of it, you can see the 2 minarets in the background. All right, just a little bit on Islamic art, and then we'll just look at some mosques. And so you guys get a sense they're a little bit different from the cathedrals that are built in the West, right? Art is guided by a central premise from the Quran, which is that there should be no graven images of God or Muhammad. So it tends to be more abstract and geometric, and that's what you'll notice when we look at it. They tend to emphasize the repetition of things. The repetition of design illustrates the vastness of God's, Allah's world, universe. They also make abstract design through polygons and arabesque and stars. So 3 different shapes that they will repeat and repeat and repeat in designs. And again, that is intended to do 2 things, actually. Show the infiniteness of Allah's universe, and to show that it is logical as well. There's logical design, right? Because if you have polygons, right, illustrated. They will also, in architecture, use a Persian invention, which is the horseshoe arch. So the horseshoe arch is more typical of Islamic architecture. All right, so this art will emphasize the infinite, complex, logical, and then it will be infused with all sorts of phrases from the Quran, especially if it's a religious building. You can have no graven images, but you can have calligraphy, right? And so calligraphy is a highly developed art in Islamic culture, and different calligraphers will have known styles, right? So if you want words written on your mosque, you would decide which calligrapher you were going to employ for that based on whether you liked his calligraphy or not, right? So it's a highly developed art style. All right, that's written. Calligraphy is written word. Here is the outside of the dome of the mosque, and here you can see two things actually. That the Islamic world took the architecture from Roman and Greeks, and in fact they literally used, especially old Roman and Greek columns. As you see here, you can see that there is the the Roman arch is used in this frontal building, which is probably an ablution fountain, and that they used or employed abstract design all over. So the exterior here, the top blue, is all abstract design. I hope I have a close-up of it. Oh, there you go. And so that's what we mean by abstract design, the use of polygons and sometimes stars and sometimes arabesque. And now I'm looking at this, I can see that there's a calligrapher and there's writings probably from the Quran on this Dome of the Rock right up here at this layer I can see. Inside the Dome of the Rock is the place. It's very sacred to Muslims because it's the place where it's believed Muhammad ascended into heaven on the holy steed. So if you went inside this octagonal building, you would find a ambulatory or walkway around, and in the center of it would be just a stony area, and that's where Muhammad was said to ascend into heaven. A typical mosque, and this is a 9th century mosque, Ibn Tulun. Here you can see it from the outside. If you look, the center part is the mosque area here, and it has an ablution fountain, a place where it's water and you can purify yourself. You would enter from this side, go in, purify yourself, and then you would go to the prayer hall, which is on the side that faces Mecca of a mosque, and it is signified by the Qibla, which is a wall that has a niche that the niche indicates it is facing Mecca. So here you can see the prayer hall on this side. I know they all look the same each side, but these are just ambulatory all the way around, right? So kind of like the ancient Greeks, they have colonnaded areas because people just need to get out of the sun. The unusual thing in this mosque, that's a typical mosque, right? The unusual thing is just that this mosque also has a massive protective wall around it. So it actually has two walls. It's basically a fortress in which there is a mosque. This is the design. Here is the minaret. Here we were looking from near the minaret, and the ablution fountain and the prayer hall right here with the Qibla on this side and the niche that indicates it is the Qibla. This is a picture from inside looking back at what is the minaret. So here's your minaret, and from the minaret the call to prayer goes out. This is looking from coming into the mosque, inside the prayer area to the ablution fountain and then to the minaret on the outside. And again, this is one of the oldest mosques in Cairo. So Ibn Tulun is in Cairo. Here is the prayer hall, or one part of the prayer hall. You have about 3 or 4 sections here that look just like this. If you started to walk in and went further, you'd find another colonnaded area and another, right? And you can see Roman and Greek column design. They look actually here like pilasters, so they're just stuck onto big piers that are being used. Also, I forgot to show you, just back once, here is an example of a horseshoe arch, right? It comes in just a little bit at the end. It's almost like the Gothic arch, but it comes in just a little bit, and that's a horseshoe arch. Inside on the Qibla, or the wall facing Mecca, we have the niche that is called the Mihrab, and it's the indication of which way Mecca is, because you face Mecca when you pray. And then you have the minbar, where an imam gives up to give a prayer or a talk, and that's what the minbar is. Here you can see you have a illustration of the use of stars in a pattern that are intended to go out and out and out, and you can see that the design breaches the barriers that it's in, so it indicates that it goes on forever. Most of these patterns do that, right? And then you can see just the prevalence of all the geometric patterns on this particular Qibla in Ibn Tulun. The last mosque, and this is from the 8th century, I want to show you, has a very peculiar thing, but it really shows you what Spain, the experience of Spain itself. It's basically symbolic of this experience of Spain. And this is the mosque in Cordoba. Ooh, come back here. And here you can see this is one of the entryways into the mosque, but it too, just like Ibn Tulun, it looks like a fortress. It's got a long hall over, and it's got a very small courtyard, so it's almost the opposite of Ibn Tulun in the sense that the courtyard's very small and the prayer area is quite large. And then slammed into the middle of it, right here, is a cathedral. So once the Muslims were defeated in Cordoba, the Christians came in and they put a cathedral right in the middle of it, and here you can see it from the top. So it's like this mosque with a courtyard, and it's got orange trees in its courtyard, very small. You can see the minaret here, call to prayer, and then you would enter the prayer hall area, right, with a marker for the Qibla that faces Mecca here. Back, sorry, oops, back. And so that's the Qibla. And then the Christians came in, and here you've got a beautiful cathedral that was slammed right in the middle of it. It's wonderful in some ways, right? I like, too, how you can see it's a fortress, and the wall around it is very high and very thick, and then the city comes up right close, so you get a kind of a sense of how the medieval city was to the mosque itself and then the cathedral. Here's the inside, and here in architecture you can illustrate the effort to show the continuance of the infiniteness of the universe with this Roman arch that's used and Roman columns that are used over and over again. As you look into the space, they seem to go on and on and on, and they're intentionally that way. And then here, we can't look close to it, but you can see that it's all abstract design in a dome inside of the cathedral at Cordoba. All right, so that's the end. You guys should have a good sense of the founding of the Muslim Empire, some of its political history through the Umayyad and Abbasid, and the scholarship of the Golden Age under the Abbasid Empire, and some of the scholars and discoveries emphasizing the discovery of algebra and the emphasis on geography and the hard sciences and maths, some of which would come to Europe in the Renaissance. And then finally a little discussion of the 5 pillars and the art in Islam, in the art and architecture actually in Islam. Highly geometric, highly abstract, emphasizing the infiniteness and the logic of Allah's universe. And I will see you in class.